Welcome, Protege. In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to create functions, which are very powerful in all programming languages. They help you minimize redundant code and help organize it as well. I already created a script with the boilerplate code, and we're going to show you 3 different examples of using functions. The first example would just be a simple one where we show you the syntax, and we're just returning one variable. The second example will show how you can return a matrix. And the third example will show how you can return multiple variables or matrices. Let's get started with our first example. When you create a function, you actually have to create a new script. I'm going to go to the command window and do that. And our first function is going to be called add variables. And just like you create a regular script, you create functions the same way. Just go ahead and hit enter. Yes, we want to create it. And now we have a similar window that we've been writing our scripts in. First off, you need to have function first. Next, you have the variables that you want to return from your function. I just have one variable that we're going to return called a. Then you have your function name, and this has to be the same as your function script name. Otherwise, you'll get an error saying it can't find the function. And then you have your input arguments. Which I have 4 input arguments and 1 return variable. And these can be as many as you like. I usually only limit these to, say, 1 to 4 variables each. Now that we created our function header, we can now start writing the function body. And this is a simple addition of the variables that we pass in. So we just have one line within our function. And you have to make sure that these variables are the same name as your input arguments so that you're able to use them in your calculation. And also this needs to be the same as your output variable. Otherwise you'll get an error saying that you're not returning the variables that you specified. And I'll show you that later. And you also have to add n to your function. Okay, this function is complete. Let's go ahead and save this. And then let's bring up our function example script. And we can call the function and pass in our arguments. So this line is going to call our function add variables, and it'll pass in 2, 3, 4, and 5. And from our function, we see that we're going to add all those variables. So for this example, we should get 14. Let's go ahead and run this. And sure enough, we get our variable a returned, and the value is 14. Let's move on to our second example. I'm going to comment this first example out first. And this example is going to be a function that returns a matrix. Let's go ahead and create the function for that. I'm going to call it red channel. And what this function will do is we'll pass in a RGB image, and it will return just the red channel of that image. Again, you have to start off with function, then your output matrix, since we want to return a matrix here. Then your function name, which has to be the same as the .m script that you just created. And then we want to pass in the image name, so I'm just going to put str1 here for short for string1. Our function header is finished, so let's start creating the body. I'm going to create a variable called img, short for image, and we're going to do an imRead of the image that we pass into this function. And you should know how to grab the red channel from one of our previous tutorials, but if you don't remember, you use the colon operator to grab all the rows and all the columns, and then you specify which 2D matrix you want within the 3D matrix of the RGB image. And the red channel is the first 2D matrix, so we pass in 1 for the third argument here. We want to add a semicolon to suppress the output, and then I'm going to show the image with imShow. And don't forget your end. Okay, this function is complete. Let's save this, and let's go back to our script and call this function. And I'm going to use one of MATLAB's images that is built into the toolbox, and that's called Peppers. And don't forget to put the single quotes around it. Let's go ahead and run this. Forgot the S on pepper. Go ahead and run that. And it returns the red channel of the RGB image, as you can see here. Going to close out of this image. And let's move on to our third example. I'm going to comment this one out. And our next example will be a function that returns multiple matrices. You can also return multiple variables, but we're not going to cover that one in this tutorial, but it should be pretty straightforward. And similar to the previous example, we're going to create a function where we pass in an image, but this time instead of it returning only a single channel, we're going to return all 3 channels. So let's go ahead and create this function. I'm going to call it RGB channels. Yes. And we can start writing our function header. If you're returning more than 1, then you have to use square brackets. And then name all 3 output matrices. Then our function name, RGB channels, and we pass in a string into this function. Our header is complete, so let's move on to writing the function body. We want to read in the image that we pass in to our str1 variable, and then let's start creating the matrices that grab each individual channel. So we're grabbing the red channel first. I'm going to copy and paste this for the other channels and just change these. And then I'm going to show each channel individually. This function is complete. Save that. Let's pull up our script and call the function. And since we're returning 3 matrices with this function, we also need to have square brackets to create the matrices for each one. And I'm just going to use the same variable names that we used in our function. And these names can be anything you want, but I usually like to keep them the same. Let's run this. And looks like it worked. We were able to show each channel individually since we have 3 figures. This was the blue channel, this was the green channel, and this was the red channel. Going to close those. Comment this out. Let's say that we only wanted 2 out of 3 of the matrices that is being returned by the function. And to do that, I'm just going to copy paste this first. And let's say we don't want the red channel. So we can just put a tilde there saying that we don't want the red channel. And to show you that, let's run this. It still outputted each figure, but notice that it only returns 2 out of the 3 variables. We don't create a matrix for the red channel. Going to comment this out and go back to our previous function. And notice that we have each output matrix that we specified within our square brackets. We have these here, the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. What happens if we don't have one of the names for our output matrices? I'm just going to change this to X and show you what happens. When I hit Shift Enter, it changed this variable. So I'm going to run this again, and it should return an error now. Yep. So we got an error saying that output argument, the blue channel, was not assigned during the call to that function, since we changed the blue channel here to X. So I'm going to change this back to blue channel. And I'm going to comment this out and go back to our first function that we created and show you something cool. So I have this function, and notice that when I begin typing it, it shows the different input arguments that are defined in your function. And notice that the one that you're on is highlighted blue. So if I type in 2 for the B variable, then go to the next one, the next input argument gets highlighted. So we have 3. Then we go to the next one, now D is highlighted, 4, and 5. And then notice if we put too many input arguments in, then we start to get this cannot display function hint. So that's a really neat feature that MATLAB has. For a quick recap, we went over 3 different examples about using functions. Our first example was just a simple function to get you used to the syntax, and we simply just passed in 4 variables, and then we added all those together and returned that to this A variable. Our next function, we returned a matrix where our input argument was a string, and we input the image that we wanted to return the red channel. And then our third example was a function that returned multiple matrices where our input argument was an image string name, and then it returned each red, green, and blue channel individually. And we also learned how to suppress one of the output variables or matrices by using this tilde. And that's it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe below or leave a question or comment.